G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, we're going to go through my team selection for the Chinese Grand Prix and recap everything that happened in Melbourne. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. So we'll jump quickly into my race week review for Australia and then recap everything that happened from the weekend and what that means for our teams in China this coming weekend. So in Melbourne, I had 121 points, good for just inside the top 300k. All in all, a pretty mixed result of driver and constructor scores. I think coming out of free practice felt okay and qualifying felt okay about the team. But there was so much carnage during the race that I just wasn't sure what to expect from them. All drivers and constructors for that matter. Oscar Piastri, 20 points on the 2X, looked pretty good until he spun out in the latter stages of the race, went from about 25 to 30 points all the way down to 10. So not good there, but the highlight of my team this weekend was Lance Stroll and Nico Hülkenberg, both banking 16 or more points after what I thought were on the deadline stream on Saturday. Drivers I could rely on in the wet. Now, if anyone showed out for the deadline stream, thank you so much. It was a blast and we're going to be doing more of those this season. But two drivers that weren't in my team after free practice but decided to move towards them for their experience in these kind of conditions. Drivers, on the other hand, that really failed in the wet was Isaac Hadjar and Gabriel Bortoleto. Hadjar crashed on a formation lap, started the season off before we'd even raced a single lap with a -20. And then Bortoleto kind of lost control of the car and as a result came away with another DNF. So not ideal. Two of the four rookies that didn't finish the race were in my team, but I do think I was probably not quite as hard done by as some of the other guys in F1 Fantasy. And to round it out, I had 36 from Ferrari and 67 from Mercedes. A pretty solid outing. Ferrari could have been on for a few more points, but they completely butchered their tyre strategy. Classic Ferrari. And I do think there's probably week to week a better chance of them scoring more than 36 if they can get on top of these strategy calls. 67 was a pretty impressive result for Mercedes, all things considered. The second best constructor score this weekend after McLaren, and George Russell finishing on the podium and Kimi Antonelli coming home in fourth. Definitely a result I did not expect, particularly with Kimi starting all the way back in P16 in a dreadful qualifying on Saturday to come all the way through the field in these conditions as a rookie. A truly commendable result. So a big fan of that drive from him. And I definitely think also opens the door for him as a potential fantasy asset moving forward. So we're going to take a look at some of my weekend notes, what this means for our fantasy teams heading into China. Now, I think the one thing that is to be said is there has been so much DNF carnage in Australia. 6 drivers didn't finish the race. 4 of them were rookies and pretty much struggled the whole way through. If you include Behrman's not classified in qualifying on the Saturday and his mixed results in free practice as well, it was not a good weekend for him. And even Kimi wasn't looking all that crash hot until we got to Saturday. So, I mean, Kimi didn't even make it out of Q1 on Saturday. So what am I saying? But I think the rookies have definitely had themselves a baptism of fire. I wouldn't say this is going to be a regular occurrence, but for the most part of that reason for bringing in Stroll and Hülkenberg was to limit that kind of rookie exposure in the wet weather. And a lot of people I saw have 3 or 4 DNFs. I felt like 2 was lucky enough, but there are also some people that had 1 or even 0. So if you were in that camp, I have to say the F1 fantasy gods were smiling down on you this weekend. Now, I think Mercedes surprisingly competitive, as I pointed out. Kimi and George think they'll be there and thereabouts throughout the season. And McLaren, obviously their biggest rival in terms of points on the podium, was, although very strong, and Oscar's error, I thought he drove excellently with the exception of obviously one turn. I think they will be even stronger in the dry conditions throughout the season. So that's why I'm eyeing off a McLaren Williams Norris approach for future weeks. And I think also Carlos Sainz have to be hard done by if you owned him. Such a shame for him to lose control of the car under, I think it was yellow flags in the first lap after Doohan crashed. So yeah, I think they'll bounce back, and I do believe that Williams will be a nice pairing with McLaren throughout the first half of the season. In terms of price changes, As you've probably seen, the asset values have been pretty swingy so far. And so as a result of that, there has been quite a few teams after the first race that have come into China with less than 100 million. Now, just on that, I think it pays to be patient. I know it's obviously easy to knee jerk and look at these budgets and scores and such and really panic. Fantasy Tools made a funny joke that you'd better off starting your fantasy season from week 2. But I think it kind of indicates that for the first couple of weeks, price changes are going to be a little iffy until we get to week 3 and adjustments normalize based on the points per million basis and all of the metrics that feed into those adjustments. Just some thoughts and very initial ones at that, but the consensus I'm seeing for the most part is that if your team really suffered in Australia value-wise, there's certainly an option to pull the ripcord on the wildcard right away to get off those poisonous assets, as they're termed. If you've got drivers that have DNF'd a multiple of them, it's very likely they're going to continue to go down for the next couple of weeks on this pricing model, this current pricing model. To avoid, obviously, those price drops continuously, going for the wildcard would not be the worst idea. And to the contrary, if your team's doing quite well, over 100 million, perhaps Limitless wouldn't be a bad idea to try and ride those price gains into China and out of China. So I'm probably in the school of thought that's neither of those two options. But again, my opinion could change as we approach the deadline this weekend. So just something to keep in mind, and obviously based on your team structure and what you can do with your budget available. I'm going to quickly talk about these two drivers for a couple minutes, one of which I own, one of which I don't. But in essence, really want to talk about the performance of Alex Albon, carried that Williams team after Sainz went out on lap 1. Now at 16% ownership, somewhat of a differential, I'd say, and I think overlooked perhaps in favour of Carlos Sainz. But to come away with 17 fantasy points, and even though he qualified 6th, I did think he'd probably lose a few positions in the race and in the conditions. Actually, in fact, turned it around entirely, came away with a 5th place, and even though it didn't really do much in terms of overtakes and positions gained, you don't really necessarily need that quite as much. If he can hold station in the race around 6th and kind of make the odd pass, then you can't be mad about that at all. I like him as an alternative to Sainz. Does Sainz actually lessen in appeal simply because he has dropped in price after that result? If we go to, and I'll bring it up on screen here now, you can actually see Carlos Sainz now lower than Alex Albon, 0.1 million. Is now the time to buy in on Carlos Sainz, or do you wait one more week to see what his price is? Where is Carlos Sainz? Here he is. Do you wait one more week, or do you buy in on now an asset like Albon increasing in price? Maybe at the same price right now, I'd go for Alex Albon. I'm not sure why the values keep resetting when I hover the mouse over Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz. But notwithstanding that, I do like Albon. Get in on the early price rises, ride that for a couple of weeks, and then maybe move off into someone else. As for Nico Hülkenberg, kind of the similar thought process here. I own him. I moved him in for the reliability on the deadline stream, and I think you want those assets that just avoid DNFs. Sure, if they go down in value, not ideal, but I think the fact that the rookies really were struggling out there in the wet, I don't expect that the level of chaos and carnage is going to continue every single week, but I do think having Hülkenberg as a reliable fantasy asset, even if he gets you kind of 3 to 7 fantasy points each week, is not the end of the world. I don't expect 20 every weekend, but even if he qualifies around 17th like he did on Saturday, that's fine by me. If he can, qualify at the back, pick up a few passes, a couple of positions gained, that's all I really expect from the guy. And the fact he only had 2 DNFs last year kind of speaks to the level of reliability and consistency you are getting from the German driver. So I own him. I don't plan on parting ways with him just yet. And the fact that he came away with 20 points, certainly a huge shock from me this weekend as an owner. Now we'll quickly just dovetail into my early team thoughts. I've got at risk more in a sense of, for these drivers, ones that I could potentially move away from to capitalize on price increases for other drivers. Stroll and Hulkenberg right now feel like holds to me just because of, as I said, those $0.6 million increases. And based on the PPM thresholds, I'll go through my budget building guide in a separate video. It seems to me that these price rises, maybe not as significant each week, but price rises nonetheless could be sustained for a couple more weeks. So that's why I'm inclined to stick with Hulk and Stroll for the time being, and even Bortoletto, not because of his price rise, because he didn't have one, it actually dropped, but he is the cheapest asset in the game, so it is hard for me to pivot away from him in one move. Now, I do want to go through some possible options I'm contemplating. The first one I spoke about before was going from this to a McLaren, Williams, and Lando Norris. This would be a -10 off the rip. I'm not overly excited about pulling a -10 in the second race of the season, but McLaren are such a strong team. They will be even more dominant in dry conditions. I think Lando's 59 points is probably a little high for every single week. The fact he banked fastest lap, driver of the day, pole position, race win. I don't see that happening every single race weekend. Sure, I can see him scoring 25 to 35 most races, maybe on a sprint a little more, but 59 is pretty high. So for that reason, pulling a -10 seems a little knee-jerky. The one thing I would say, going for Williams after a price drop for me feels like not a bad idea. I want to try and get in good assets as they're going down in price to obviously ride those bounce backs in the following weeks. So Williams feels like a good option there, but again, would not be so incentivized if I'm pulling -10. But it is, to be fair, it is Lando, McLaren, and Williams. I think they're all very reliable assets. So I've done -10s for a lot worse. So I wouldn't be totally mad about that. I could obviously, if I just reset Piastri, Mercedes, Ferrari, I could do Stroll to Alonso in one move because Stroll increased, Alonso dropped. I could also get to Tsunoda. I do like the flexibility of using just one transfer and rolling the other into Japan. Why do I like doing that? Because by the third race week, we'll have a much better idea of those normalized price adjustments and what that means for, on a 3-week rolling average, the expected increases for each driver and constructor that's coming up based on historical form. Now, for me, having those 3 free transfers to move into drivers on the up, constructors on the up, would actually fill me with a lot of confidence because I think by the second week, we'll have an idea of the form and how that feeds into their price changes, and getting in on those cash cows or those drivers that might be underpriced or might have seen a couple of drops and ride those bounce back increases probably wouldn't be a bad idea. So I could go Stroll to Alonso for 1 week. I feel like that might be a bit of a sideways trade. And the only other thought I've given is going Behrman in, Hadjar out. Again, I don't really think there's too much stock I should put in this. But the one thing I will say in favour of Behrman is, even though he had an absolute shocking weekend with Haas, I wouldn't even say getting to the end of the race was a highlight, but compared to the rest of his weekend, it was, is that the Haas is so dreadful. He and Ocon will probably qualify between P17 and P20 every single race week. Just having a driver that sits at the back, stays out of trouble, picks up a few positions gained when DNFs arise. You saw that in Australia. He didn't do anything at all with Haas in Australia. He ran at the back for the entire time. He got lapped. And as long as he just keeps the car on the island, I do think that's all you'd really want from Behrman. He doesn't need to get 5, 10, 15 points. He just doesn't need to DNF. That's all I'm asking from the guy. And being that far back out of danger, away from kind of any first turn risk, doesn't actually feel so bad, in theory at least. So I've got just enough to move to him again in one move, so I could do that. But right now, kind of toing and froing over what I could potentially do with one transfer or 3 in the first week. If I went wildcard, I'll probably talk about this more in my final thoughts, but I'd probably think about targeting assets on the rise. I talked about McLaren and Williams. I think Williams will rebound a little bit. And in terms of drivers to target, I think Kimi or George Russell, probably Kimi, because he is approaching A-tier status already. That's kind of crazy to think. Kimi Antonelli, 1 million away from the A-tier. But I think he's going to go up again. I absolutely think he's going to go up again in China, unless he DNFs, of course. And so with that, what could we do with 12.9? We could get Alex Albon or Carlos Sainz. I actually really like this. A couple of reliable B tiers to obviously boost the price. I don't think I'd have enough to do anything here. What if, like, this is obviously a wildcard team at this point if I'm even contemplating something like this, but 13 million would actually be enough for Sainz too. That's a pretty nice wildcard team if I'm being completely honest. All B-tier drivers all B-tier assets except for McLaren. So again, I'll reassess in my final thoughts, but I think that could be a really nice preliminary wildcard right now. But I'm going to leave it there for now, guys. As always, been a pleasure dissecting F1 Fantasy, but I'll be back with my final thoughts later in the week. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. And in the meantime, have a great day, and I will see you all very soon.